The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
And good day, good night. Welcome to Soccer Today for October 6, 2017. Duane is on assignment today. I'm Kevin Laramee, and joining me today on the show, Jeff Rueter of MLSsoccer.com and many other places. Jeff, how you doing this morning?
Doing well, Kevin. Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be able to fill in at least a little bit while Duane's away.
Oh, it's truly our pleasure. Jeff, we'll start with the hot news. A few days ago, almost a week now, you broke the news that Nashville FC will be a MLS expansion. It'll be a choice. Let's put it this way. What can you tell us about Nashville?
Well, I can tell you first off that 48 hours immediately following was an absolute whirlwind. So I guess the Nashville has always been seen as something of an underdog through this entire process, Kevin. So if you remember when they had the 12 bids put together their launch videos, or right after they announced, I think this was back in January, I want to say, possibly December, where all 12 expansion candidates put together their public-facing kind of bids, and just so some would do videos, some would do PowerPoints, things like that. Nashville's was by far the weakest, I seem to recall. Basically, the crux of theirs was that it was the city of Nashville. Here's a great Jack White guitar solo, which, don't get me wrong, I love Jack White, but there wasn't any sort of soccer history that they could point to. Nashville has never been able to successfully host a professional team, and actually they won't until next year with Nashville SC joining the USL. So they were always seen as something of a kind of a last choice, one that seemed like they just kind of wanted to get out there and remind people that Nashville wants professional soccer, probably for a lower division instead. But as we've seen over this year so far, bids that seemed ironclad, like St. Louis, suddenly shoot themselves in the foot with stadium issues. Sacramento seemed like an absolute lock to join next year, but then when they had their ownership issues, as they were trying to figure out whether or not they'd stay Republic or if they were going to kind of branch off, that delayed their process as well. Cincinnati, stadium issues. San Diego, impossible to get interest. So if you're looking at all of these bids, Nashville was able to work their way up the pecking order quite a bit. They announced on Monday their stadium plan for a $250 million stadium that looks absolutely gorgeous and should be open by 2021. And in the interim, if they would enter the league in 2019 or 2020, I would guess that they would play in the Tennessee Titans Stadium, which I think has played host to, if not a World Cup qualifier, it certainly played host to some major soccer games. I know they had an International Champions Cup game this summer that sold very well as well. So Nashville has really gone from, bottom of the barrel to being one of, I would argue, two truly ironclad, ready to join the league within a few years' notice, absolute no-brainer decisions for MLS expansion.
Now, when we're looking at, you talk about Nashville and the stadium and everything, and there's other bids that are looking not necessarily stronger, but the stadium has been done well. We've seen stadium already start to maybe being built. But when you're looking at Nashville specifically outside of the stadium, what would be one of the big incentive? Because yes, it's an emerging market in the United States. It's a market that we've seen last year with the Nashville Predators in the NHL Hockey League, how it can become vibrant, and it's a new generation of sports fans. So how important is that aspect with the Nashville?
I think that's big, and so I'm based out of Minnesota, if you can tell by my accent, listeners. But you've seen it in the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities is a very millennial trending demographic. If you're looking at this metropolitan area, Nashville similar, Portland similar. I think one of the biggest things that you have to consider in this, Kevin, is you're looking at the Pacific Northwest and you're seeing how Cascadia has absolutely skyrocketed to the top of Major League Soccer, between fan interest, rivalries, and honestly, quality of play. Portland, Vancouver, and Seattle are always challenging each other to get better because the Cascadia Cup is bragging rights. Even the Canadian Cup, you're looking and you're seeing Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver all are very competitive, all have bragging rights at risk, and so they're pushing each other harder and harder. I think the next region that Major League Soccer really wants to target is the Southeast. I know that they were a bit premature when they tried to launch Miami and Tampa at the early goings of the league, and both obviously had to get contracted. But Orlando City came in with the vision of the ownership group, the vision of Adrian Heath, and they were able to really get it off the ground finally. Kaká obviously was a major get. You look at Atlanta now. Atlanta's able to do the same thing. Miami Beckham United has been in the works for what feels like a decade now, but it's really been 3 years. And there's still no signs of when they'd be able to truly enter. But let's say you're able to get those three, and then you're able to get Nashville as well. You suddenly have 4 teams that are in exciting, vibrant markets that are spaced out just far enough where it doesn't feel like market saturation. And they're in a league that is incredibly stable. And I think that you would really be able to see, I don't know what the term would be for it, and I'm sure that locals would be best to be able to name it colloquially, but I do genuinely think that the Southeast is one of the next hotbeds for Major League Soccer, and I think that they look at what's going on in the Northwest and want to move it to the totally opposite cardinal direction in the Southeast.
Jeff, Duane's joined the call here in case you don't recognize the voice. Hi, folks. Thanks. I didn't hear the first 2 questions, so forgive me if this is crossover a little bit, but how important do you think, obviously the stadium is the biggest issue when it comes to MLS and their expansion, stadium and ownership. It's those 2 things. I always say that, it's about the stadium stupid. But, we saw in the NHL playoffs, we saw how vibrant Nashville was. We saw how youthful it was, how exciting it was. Do you think that those factors play much of a role in their decisions to go down there, sort of that young demo, fun party town kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's something to be said about the idea of, let's go back to Orlando for a second, and you look at just the city is purple at this point, right? Yeah, there's the Magic, but the Magic in the NBA never truly captured the city like I think David Stern, who was the commissioner of the NBA at the time, expected that it would. There was a brief moment in the 90s, again in the late 2000s, and that's about it. So it was a city that was really ready. And like you said, it's young, it's trendy, it's a tourist location. I mean, you look at Nashville, and if you're a fan of music of any kind, whether it's country, the blues, rock and roll, Nashville is your mecca. And so I think it's going to be a major draw. And similar to the Magic, the Predators haven't done enough to really grasp the Nashville market's attention. I think that attendance has always been a little bit questionable unless they're very competitive, which I suppose you could say about most professional sports teams these days outside of the NFL. But I do think it's a market, Duane, that you look at, and it's a no-brainer. I think that it's trending at the right time. You look at Sacramento, it would be very similar in the sense that as the city and as the urban center gets younger, it becomes more appealing. The Twin Cities certainly became an appealing destination for Major League Soccer because of how, young it is, how bike-friendly the Twin Cities are, and how they were able to put a stadium directly between the 2 metropolitan areas. So I do think that demographically, it is a major factor in why Nashville ultimately will be joining Major League Soccer within the next 4 or 5 years.
Jeff, you say that people don't show up unless they're winning. Are you familiar with the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs? Anyway, we'll leave that well enough alone.
Yes, familiar.
Fair enough. Let's talk about Minnesota a little bit. We're near the end here, not quite. They got the win over Atlanta, which had to be the moral victory, I guess, of the year to win it the way that they did in that game there, obviously against 10 men, but nonetheless to get the win late. Overall, how would you grade Minnesota's first season?
Well, I seem to recall when I was last on Soccer Today, I think it was March. It was right after that other Atlanta game, actually. And I had mentioned that I thought that this Minnesota team would ultimately finish 8th or 9th in the West, that they wouldn't be the worst team. I think I had I'd miscalculated which two teams would finish below. I certainly didn't see the Galaxy plummeting as far as they have. I thought that the Rapids would be in this area, but this feels about where with the roster that they had, with the moves that they made mid-season. None of them were flashy. You know, they didn't bring in a Nico Lodero. They didn't bring in a Victor Vasquez. They didn't bring in anyone who was really going to move the needle for this season. But I think you look at Sam Nicholson, who they brought in on the left wing. He's a Scottish youth international, came from a Heart of Midlothian. He's a tidy player. He's getting quality on the ball. That goal that Ramirez got credit for was actually a perfectly placed shot by Nicholson that ended up grazing Ramirez's shin. And Ramirez was getting credit for the goal. And as a true goal scorer and a striker, he's not going to turn that down. I'm sure he'll take Nicholson out to dinner or something. But that's the kind of move that a team like Minnesota should be making with an eye towards next year. For this year, I would say this is a B. There is room for improvement, obviously. I think that there are 3 or 4 areas on the field that I would in particular be targeting this off season. But I think you can see the core between Ramirez, between Francisco Calvo, between Brent Kallman even, who's been an absolute standout and a kind of a diamond in the rough, who was brought in on near league minimum from the NASL team. You look at Ibsen, who's been one of the most under-heralded players in Major League Soccer this year. And I think that if you're looking top to bottom, there's very real reason to be optimistic that this Minnesota United team could challenge for the 5th or 6th seed in the 2018 Western Conference.
Now, they added Chris Wright to the ownership group a little while back there. Any significant changes come from something like that, a move like that? Do you see a different direction next year?
Massively. So I think Chris Wright, first off, is a no-brainer. I think that's a perfect hire. He's been in the market for 25 years. He helped bring the Timberwolves from their second year of existence, because they were brought in alongside, was it Vancouver or Toronto? And they were, just kind of stumbling through that first season, and Chris Wright really helped right that ship. He helped launch the Minnesota Lynx, who won their 4th WNBA championship in 7 years 2 nights ago. So he understands what it takes to take a young sports franchise and turn it into something much more stable. Minnesota United will need that. I think it'll help that he's also a soccer mind. He did play for Hull City as a goalkeeper in his youth days, and then he did also travel around non-league and semi-pro leagues across England when he was in his 20s, also as a goalkeeper. So he does understand the game. It's not going to be, kind of somebody who appreciates it because their nephew plays, because they're told it's the right business influence. He loves the game. And I think that you're going to be able to see much more of that passion coming out during the offseason and during the early goings of this next year. As far as organizational change, I don't think that's going to change an awful lot. Nick Rogers, their current president, is still in that role, and I would imagine that this just means that the stadium, which is what he's been focusing on the most, Allianz Field, I think that that's going to become his full focus for a while here. And he's been doing quite well with it. When you're looking at securing Allianz as the nominal sponsor, if you're looking at who they're bringing in as these other kind of tentpole sponsors, he's been doing a great job with that. So I think that it's in good hands, but I think having Chris Wright certainly is massively going to improve the organizational quality of Minnesota United FC.
Jeff, yesterday was one of those days for us soccer nerds, and I say us, I might include you, it depends how you view yourself, but in MLS, we have 2 of those days during the year where MLS player salaries come out, and we have a chance to dissect the decision of upper management of clubs, because it is a league with a salary cap, which means that players does have value in decision of the management. Is there any player salaries that were divulged yesterday that really come out of jump out at you in the list for Minnesota? I know Demidov, of course, $550, it does stand out, and it may be one that people don't want to hear about, but what can you tell us, and which one jumps out at you?
Well, so there were 3 major international acquisitions that Minnesota United made during this secondary transfer window over the summer. One was Nicholson, who I alluded to earlier, whose transfer I broke for ESPN FC. His salary is a little higher than I thought it would be, but not tremendously. I think it's in the $200,000 range. Maybe it's a little bit above that. So that's about what you'd expect to be able to convince a young, promising Scottish winger to leave when he had, I think, at least 2 English Football League Championship clubs after him as well. Jose Leighton, who's a budding Costa Rican international left winger who can also play a little bit of left back and a little bit of center midfield. He's coming in at $68,000. That's, if you're looking at a young CONCACAF international, I think that's a dream, right? You take a little flyer on him at near league minimum, see if he has the ability. He hasn't seen the field an awful lot. The one that does surprise me, though, and you two might be familiar of him from his Vancouver days, is Michael Boxall, the New Zealand international center back. He was on the expansion Vancouver Whitecaps team. I think he went to Santa Barbara for college and played for Vancouver for 2 years. He came back to the league having left the South African Super League, and his salary figure was announced at $243,000 as far as his guaranteed compensation. I don't know if you two want to go first with your memories of Michael Boxall, but he's been solid. He's looking more comfortable in the league, but that's with the current salary structure, I think that's a bit of an overpay.
When you're talking about my memories of him, Kevin, do you have any cricket sound effects you could throw up there?
No, I don't. But if we listen carefully, we can hear them.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Go ahead, Kevin.
That's exactly it.
No, exactly. And wait till after the break when we talk about Montreal and like Baldur with $324,000 a year. I just want to always put that caveat. Like, I personally do not necessarily care, and I'm actually glad for people when they make money and they're successful, because you have to think as a whole, it's benefit everybody if people make more money. It's just in a salary cap league where you need value and you only have a certain amount of player in your roster and you only have a certain amount of money. Yes, you have tools to play with that money like TAM and GAM and designated player, but you only have a certain amount of resources, and it's how those resources are allocated that basically dictate if your technical director, general manager, /manager are doing the right job with roster selection. And when you're looking at league-wide, is there anything that's jumping out as you as well, Jeff?
Well, first off, Kevin, I think you absolutely hit that on the head. In order for Major League Soccer to grow, players are going to need to earn more. That salary cap number is going to have to be increased. I don't think increasing allocation money, which is going to be happening for 2018 again, that's not enough. I don't think that's going to help you bring in more of these Victor Vasquez type players, right? These players who aren't DP level but are able to come in and really turn a talented top 3 of the designated player core and a young domestic core and really bring them to the next level. I think that is necessary. But then these players, you look at Brent Coleman, who I talked about earlier, he's currently on $68,000, and he's started more than half of Minnesota United's games. When Demidov was clearly not working out, Adrian Heath made the tough call to play the local kid, because he did grow up in Woodbury, which is a suburb of St. Paul, and put him in over the $550,000 Vadim Demidov. And the season started to turn around. That's when they got their RSL win, and then they brought in Cronin and Birch. But he's near league minimum for a starting center back in Major League Soccer. That's a massive underpay. And I in general, you look, and it's going to be Canadian or American defenders tend to be the most underpaid players when you're looking at Major League Soccer. So if you're trying to figure out, how are you going to grow the league, it's help those guys out, help the fullbacks, help the center backs, try to get more money influx there. They're going to be training that much harder. Your defense is going to be that much better. I will admit I didn't get to look too much at the rest of the leagues yesterday. Generally, though, I'm always most fascinated by the figures that are given for international acquisitions. Just because when you see players getting traded to and fro, obviously their salary won't change too much. Guaranteed compensation compared to base compensation really just talks about marketing money and signing bonuses and agent fees. It doesn't include incentive bonuses, which I do wish it did, because I think that's truly the the most fascinating part of any player's contract, right? Score 10 goals, you get 100,000. Score, you keep 5 clean sheets, we're going to give you, I wish those numbers would come out, but obviously that's just kind of a writer's pipe dream. But I don't know. Is there anything that stood out to you too?
You know what? In terms of what stood out to me, and this is going to sound almost like that I'm patting Toronto on the back more than they already have been patted on. But for years and years and years, the salaries here were awful. Were just out of whack. It was one of the major problems with the club, is that they would sign these players from second divisions in Algeria or something and pay them $300,000 and get into a big mess, and they'd have to reset the roster every year because they had to get rid of these contracts. And now they bring in a guy like Hassler at 65, who's done a nice little job for them as a backup to Beitashour. So at any rate, that's what stood out to me, is how well Toronto is managing the cap. They're doing everything well nowadays, and it really scares me, Jeff. I don't know what's happening. It's going to blow up at some point. I just know it.
Well, yes, I mean, it will blow up at some point. It did for the Galaxy. It will for Toronto FC. But I don't think that it's wrong to pat Toronto on the back for what they're doing. This truly might be the best top-to-bottom roster and organization and head coach that you've seen in Major League Soccer history. I know everyone wants to talk about the darlings of Atlanta United, and that's truly remarkable, especially if you're looking from an expansion standpoint. What they've done is nothing short of remarkable. People like pointing to New York City FC. It's going to be more difficult now with David Villa not at 100% for the rest of the year likely, but Toronto has been head and shoulders above the league since day one. I think the only prediction that I made this season, ahead of the season, that I'm going to get right is that Toronto will win the Supporters' Shield. And I'm pretty happy to have been right on that one. I just have a tough time seeing them getting stopped on the way to MLS Cup, and I know that's probably the thing you're most terrified to hear, Duane. But it's truly remarkable what they've been able to pull together over the last 2 years.
Yeah, it's Atlanta, I think, that most scares us here right now, just in terms of their stylistically, how they match up. But I want to move to a final topic here today. It is obviously a very big day for American soccer right now. We're a few hours away from Panama v. the USA in Orlando. Now, if the USA takes care of business down there, they're pretty much guaranteed. They are guaranteed, to be in the top 4 at that point, probably. I think anyway. I'd have to look at the math, but you would think.
Yeah, they would be. Yeah.
But if they don't, it gets a little hairy. So just tell me what your confidence level is as an American heading into this big game.
I've been talking about this with a couple of other colleagues, and I think we all suffer a little bit still from Klinsmann syndrome, where we can never feel confident in any of these CONCACAF games. Like if you were saying that in order for the United States to qualify, they'd have to beat the Netherlands, I think I'd be more confident than Panama. Just because for whatever reason, over the last 4-6 years, the United States has done better against some of those bigger nations than these sleeper teams in CONCACAF, and first off, huge credit to the teams like Panama, like Trinidad and Tobago, like Honduras. You look at what they've been able to pull together using resources, being able to put players in Major League Soccer and Liga MX in Europe, and really just develop their national team course. It's been tremendous, and I think CONCACAF needs that. I think that if you're looking at whether you're the U.S., Mexico, Costa Rica, Canada, you need a push. You need to be able to say that these Caribbean teams and these Central American teams can beat you any given day, and I think we're reaching that point where they can. So I'm not saying it's a no-brainer. I know that the United States haven't won in their last 4 matchups against Panama, and 3 of those were on home soil with draws. It's going to be more difficult than I think the greater national sports media is making it out to be. But I do think that you look at that roster, calling in Benny Feilhaber was, I think that was a smart call. I would have brought in Sasha Kljestan, maybe Lee Win instead for the same role. I think that they've been more on form over the last 12 months than Benny has, but I think Benny also has that killer instinct. He's been to a World Cup. He understands what it takes to win on an international level in a game that's really must win. So I think that was right. Honestly, I know that he hasn't played for the U.S. since January, and before that it was much longer. I wouldn't be shocked if he starts tonight in that number 10 role, and you move Pulisic to the right, and then you've got probably Paul Arriola on the left. I think that could work wonders. I think that gives you a lot of creativity. It lets Pulisic roam. It doesn't force him into a pigeonhole where he's easily marked by some of these bigger central defenders and defensive midfielders that Panama has. So I'm going to cautiously predict a 2-1 United States win tonight. And then from there, pretty much 1 point in Trinidad and Tobago against the Soccer Warriors, who just have not looked very good during this hexagonal. Should get them within one of those top 3 spots where they don't have to play the play-in game.
Yeah, they did have to play that play-in game. Do you have a preference there? Would you rather have the, political, sort of grenade that would be the Syria matchup there? I can't wait to see Twitter during that one, or the long flight to Australia. What would you rather draw there?
I would certainly rather get the 3 seed and not have to worry about that game. I think if I'm looking at it, if you're looking purely from on the pitch, I think you'd rather play Syria than Australia, because I think Australia does have more of those game-changing players than Syria does, certainly. That said, for the exact reasons that you laid out there, I really do not want to have to give opinions on a USA-Syria matchup, because I think that is an absolute death trap for anyone who tries to prognosticate on it, because I think that those tweets would easily be read by people who aren't looking at it from a soccer perspective, and I think it would get pretty ugly very quickly.
Dear God. Anyhow. I'm just going to shut up on that one, but yes, I'm imagining it right now. All right, Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to promote or talk about before we say goodbye?
Let's close with some happy feelings. There's a couple of big projects I've got in the works that I think I'll be able to announce in December, so keep an eye out for that. It's not a Nashville expansion, but it's something more personal. I've got pieces that'll be coming up shortly with The Guardian, with 442, with ESPN, and with Howler Magazine. Those are kind of my big 4 these days. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Jeff Rueter, Rueter. And if you don't subscribe to this podcast, you're missing out. I've got to say, guys, you've been doing a great job this year. My brother and I only listen to it. We'll have podcast banter about certain shows, and yours is one of them. So really keep up the great work, you two.
Well, thank you. A blush there, a blush emoji. All right.
Thanks, Jeff. And the check is in the mail.
All right. Sounds good.
Have a good one.
Guys.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at SoccerTodaySPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
And we're back on Soccer Today. Duane, it's always a pleasure to talk to Jeff, and you missed it early on, but his life 24 hours after the Nashville story must have been quite a whirlwind. His phone must have been blowing up a lot.
Well, yeah, I know. I remember what it was like, and that was back in 2010 is when Vancouver and Portland got the franchise's name to them in their expansion bid there, and back then, I mean, everything was down a little notch in the scale. It was 7 years ago, right? So I could only imagine, how intense that was for me at that point when I made that report. And, it was just one of my better sources. In fact, it was the same source that was feeding me a lot of Canadian Premier League stuff. So at any rate, there you go. Had him for a while. Probably shouldn't have said him. I guess that the cat's out of the bag now. One of my main sources is male. There you go.
Exactly. It just eliminates 50% of the chances. But it's always a pleasure to talk to Jeff, and it's always interesting to hear more behind the scenes with the Nashville expansion project, and especially Minnesota. And you know what? He pretty much nailed it. He predicted 9th before the beginning of the season. That's where they are. They're probably not going to move up. Probably not going to move down. It's probably where they're going to finish in about 3 weeks.
Fair enough. We should try to talk, yeah. Look, I famously, actually, I'm going in after this, after we're done the podcast, to pay my debt to the charity that I made the bet on that they wouldn't finish over 24 points, and they've shattered that pretty well. They really did turn it around after that first month, right? At that time, at the start of the season, they truly were terrible, and it had to do with their backline choices.
The first 4 games were terrible. I think the Sam Cronin trade made a big difference in this season, and the realization that like Demidov and other players that they got were not going to pan out, and the Venegas, and they were able to turn around and adjust the situation. And that's kind of one of the positive thing I do see in Adrian Heath's role this year is, you know what? Even though I was given those tools, during the season, when you realize that, look, this is not working, I have to change something, that player's not panning out, and I have to adjust the situation, he did. And with certain success, not necessarily success at the end of the year, but you're looking at, well, they had spurts. That victory against Atlanta will probably be the highlight of their first MLS season. But you do have that realization that, look, at least the coach is willing to make difficult decisions.
Yeah, and look, what I'll give them a lot of credit on in this is, and again, I always go back to my history with TFC and watching what they did wrong for all those years, because it really does inform a lot of how you think about the league when you lived through that. TFC made those mistakes. I spoke to that about Jeff and the thing. They made big salary errors. They recruited poorly from overseas. And the problem with them is they would stick with them for a full year and like sort of bang their head against a wall. And then they go, oh, well, that didn't work. And they throw it all out. Well, at least with Minnesota's case, they made changes on the fly. They looked at their talent and they went, I know we paid $550,000 for him, and enjoy your paycheck, sir. You're going to be gone at the end of the year, but enjoy that for the year, do some tourist stuff, walk around, have some fun, enjoy your year. But we're going to play this kid. And they were brave enough to make that decision. And that type of stuff is, vital. You've got to own up to your mistakes quickly in this league. You can't afford to make too many of them. You can afford to make mistakes so long as you recognize them and quickly fix them. Because if you don't, you can get into a spiral that's never going to end. The next step Minnesota needs to take, I think, is they need to sort of get that very top end game breaker sort of player, the big DP.
Yeah, that one DP, and yeah, you're right. That 1 or 2 DP to help them break that glass ceiling and be a top 7-6 team instead of 8 and 9. No, and it's interesting too, looking at the salaries, and you're looking at Minnesota, but other teams too. You realize certain mistakes that were done, and some players that are maybe there for other reason than just being a player on the field. You have a lot of reason why you have certain players, and I have to say, Duane, looking at the roster of the Montreal Impact, I've been quite dumbfounded yesterday.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of players there that are jumping out as maybe a bit overpaid for what they've contributed this year. You're always going to find that when a team's struggling, though. But what in particular, Kevin Lowe? Tell me in particular.
It's when you're looking at the DP situation. Nacho Piatti, $450,000. Blair Zamali, $750,000. So you're using a DP spot for Piatti for this year that maybe you could have just worked with it without allocation. But then you turn around and you're looking at salaries like Laurent Simon, $630,000. And yes, I'm great that Laurent Simon makes that amount of money. That's not the problem. I'm just saying it costs a lot of allocation money, of general or targeted allocation money, to bring that salary down to a manageable size for the cap. And you have other instances like Dejan Baldor, who barely played for Montreal since arriving on loan from Bologna, and his salary is $324,000. Him barely being in the plans of Mauro, barely playing in the, yes, I've seen some very small flashes of brilliance in his game, but very, very short spurts. Like in the air, he's physical, he's a big body, very tall. He could be successful in aerial balls, but what he has shown, I don't think has been worth $324,000, and it's so high. Like, that salary makes no sense to me so much that I'm wondering what's the reason behind his presence with Montreal. Maybe it's a way to help Bologna have more money to go forward and get other players. No, I know I'm speculating here, but just the players' worth and value, especially in a salary cap league, in my mind, does not come even close to $324.
Well, you know that I'm skeptical of the Bologna relationship and have been for a while. I mean, Joey has every right to own that team, but I just wonder whether.
By the way, even if he does that for that reason, it's his prerogative. It's his club. I'm just saying, I'm not taking judgment on it. I'm just saying this amount, this figure, is a bit out of whack. It doesn't fit the situation. So there must be other reasons behind.
Well, here. This is what I'll say, and this is something I can legitimately, I think, say about the Bologna relationship that is neither. It's neutral. It's a neutral opinion. One of the problems with relying on that and leaning on that to bring players in, and I know a lot of Montreal fans will say that about that. Oh, we can utilize them. We can bring players in on loan, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the problem is Serie A pays their players more than MLS in general, right? So if you bring a player in on that, part of what they're going to be paid is going to be related to the loan fee, because you're going to have to pay something. There's going to have to be some kind of transfer of the contract. The contract's just naturally going to be bigger unless you bring them in permanently and renegotiate something. So that's probably part of the issue right there, is that you're dealing with a league that just pays players more. When you bring players over from there, then they're naturally going to get paid more. So you better make very good choices when you bring them over. And, Montreal's kind of been hit and miss so far with that, and that's going to be an ongoing thing to monitor, but certainly, those kind of mistakes make an error. I'm surprised by Piatti and how little he's making, to be honest, but he probably deserves more, and I'm not too sure what the rationale there is.
And he was more last year, and he's probably, for sure, going to have more for the next 2 years. His current contract finishes in June 2018. And his new one will take effect for a year and a half, bringing this to 2 full years of Nacho Piatti, like we have been speculated here on the show for months now, and we'll see it happen. But there's other salaries, like we mentioned. I know we're hyper-focusing on the Montreal Impact, but it's the one I haven't spent more time looking deep in the numbers. Matteo Mancosu, $700,000, $719 with guaranteed compensation in 2017. That's a big salary raise from last year, yes. It's a big chunk of targeted allocation money to bring this level under the DP level that Piatti and Zemali have. And, well, it didn't pan out quite correctly for Montreal this year. So far, 5 goals from Mancosu, $700,000. That's a few $100,000 a goal, and that's a lot for Major League Soccer.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at Vancouver real quickly. I mentioned Toronto in the other interview, and what I have to say about Toronto, Hasslers, they really didn't add a lot in the middle of the season, so we already talked about their salaries a way back, but I like the Hassler move. He has surprised the hell out of everyone in this city in terms of how well he came in and adjusted. I mean, who knew, right? Who knew that they would be able to find a player like that where they found him? But nonetheless, he came in for 65 base, and it's like 90 guaranteed. So that's a pretty nice little piece of business there. Looking at the Whitecaps.
Well, you know what jumps out at me for the Whitecaps, Duane, is
what's that?
We've talked about this last year when we were dissecting how you look at a player's salary sheet. Salaries that are important to look at is the one below 100,000, because if it's players that do anything of worth during the club, they're worth that, at least that during the first few seasons, and players over like the DP amount. It's in the middle that are costly in a salary cap league. It's a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 players yearly that does make a big chunk of that salary cap. So when you're able to keep a lot of your worthy players close to 100,000 or below and have those DP markers, you have a bit more depth. You have a bit more deep of a team because you're able to either get a lot of value on the salary cap or actually get the gems. And that's what we're seeing with the Whitecaps. Very few players in between. You have that first case, players around the $100,000 mark, either young players or veteran, but not too expensive. And you have the DP ones, and they're saving a bit. That means they can have a bit more depth because they don't have those 300,000 and 400,000 players.
Yeah, well, yeah, that is what jumps out when you look at this, is there's not a lot of guys in here that you would call TAM players, right? So that's Vancouver's next evolution. Probably, well, they do need, as we said for many, many, many years, they need to sign someone that's going to be a star there eventually. But nonetheless, that seems to be something that's not going to happen. But they don't seem to be bringing in a lot of guys in that 500 range either, that the Vasquez's or whomever. But I do like, I do like the fact that they got the kid in at 65,000. You know, Davies is in there real cheap, and he's been contributing. You mentioned if you get your guys under 100,000 contributing, then you're doing well. I'm not crazy about the one Kendall Watson's contract, but I'm not crazy about Kendall Watson, period. So that's probably what that one comes down to. I know that he's hot and cold. When he's hot, he's probably worth that. When he's cold, he's not. The keeper, Onstead at 350, that's maybe why they brought in the New Zealand international there to maybe look long term. He's in at 65, so they've been able to get him a real cheap deal there. And
well, if you're looking at the roster and where they could potentially save money going forward, David Osted's position at 360 for a goalkeeper, it's a lot. And I remember in the Joe Bendick days of Toronto where you and I were talking about how much of a goalkeeper should be worth. Is it worth to go, like, the benefit? And that's before Tim Howard DP days. We're talking about it here in the world of goalkeeper in Major League Soccer. We were talking about how, is it worth it to have a goalkeeper over 160, 180? Like, that surplus of money that you're paying. And again, I don't care about the individual making money. I'm just talking about the asset and not like an individual side of the sport. So as a business, as a salary cap league, a player is an asset. And is it worth it to pay more than 160, 180 for a goalkeeper? Is that dividend worth it? The amount of points you'll get more because of another, if you put another goalkeeper in, is that dividend, that difference worth it? And at that time we said no, and we probably feel the same way. So David Osted's salary of 360, you can probably save a $200,000 by getting a very good goalkeeper and still saving $200,000 to make your team even more deep.
It is so difficult to evaluate what contribution a keeper does to a team. I mean, you can look at a midfielder and sort of evaluate his ability to pass, his ability to set up, or if he's a defensive midfielder, you can look at things like interceptions or even just work rate, like how much they run or sprints or whatever. Like there's lots of stats out there nowadays that you can look at, and they do at every level, or just eyeball. You can watch those things. Oh, that guy's a beautiful passer of the ball. He's a great crosser. You know, if he's a wing back, or he's tackles well if he's a defender. But a keeper is such an oddball position, right? Like it's so difficult to evaluate other than shot stopping, and that's the one that jumps out. But sometimes, you know, as I've said many times before, it's about positioning with keepers as much as anything else. So maybe when they're making the spectacular stops, they're actually a little bit out of position, so they may not be as valuable. So it's just so hard, and that's why I've always sort of felt that if you can get a serviceable keeper at that 150, 160, maybe 200 at the top end, because salaries are the cap is creeping up. So, you know, our 170 of the Bendick conversation might be 200 now, but nonetheless, something that's in the same context in terms of the cap as it stands makes sense. And I think that maybe you might see a move there. And like, would it make a big difference? Like if you took a guy that's, you know, Onstead is obviously a talented player, certainly a great shot stopper, but does he make that much of a difference? I'm not sure. And we've seen that in Toronto with the, you know, as much as we liked, Fry, obviously Fry went and bit us in the back, and I guess that's the ultimate, FU when it comes to Toronto's keeping.
Does it still hurt? Is it still stinging a bit?
Well, no, the thing about Steph Fry and that save and Steph Fry and TFC is he played so long for TFC, and he was one of the best performers consistently, and just a good community guy, and I met him a couple times. It's hard to not like Stephen Fry.
He's a class
good
act
guy.
Yeah, he's a class act too. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it was like, you know, now that it doesn't sting. No, we'll go down this rabbit hole for a bit. It doesn't sting, no, but it sort of makes me chuckle every so often, because for years and years and years and years, that was the joke. It's like, oh, who's going to score against Toronto today? And you'd look at the roster and go, oh, him, because he played for TFC. It was always the former TFC players that would come and bite them in the butt. And, well, MLS Cup final, what happens is the player that bites them in the butt is the former TFC player. So even when they're good, old habits die hard. So it's kind of just funny at this point. So we're going to be looking carefully at the Western Conference playoffs. And you know, obviously they have to take care of their own business, but who's going to come in for MLS Cup final? They're going to have to mark that player out pretty well. Anyhow, Kevin, shall we move topics here? Do you have any final salary conversations you want to have? We should probably talk about Argentina a little bit.
Yeah, we should. A 0-0 draw yesterday, Argentina. But just if you have any comments on the salaries, let us know. You can email us, sportspodcastnetwork@gmail.com. On Twitter, Duane's at 24th Minute. I'm at Kev Laramee. The show's at Soccer Today, SPN. Let us know your thoughts on any MLS player's salary. But Duane, there's a possibility that in Russia next year there won't be any Messi.
Yeah. Look, when you look at Knoebel's standings, there's also a possibility he'll be there. They're pretty tight. And the other part of that story is the 0-0 draw has kept Peru in the picture, which would be the first time since '82 if they were to make that. And I have a good friend who's Peruvian, so I'm worried that he might be in a ditch somewhere. I have to go find him after the show. But at any rate, if you know him, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, there was a big article yesterday that was floating around about what would it mean if the U.S. missed the World Cup, and I think that Americans are panicking a little bit about what that would mean for the game in the United States, and my answer to that question is it wouldn't mean anything. The U.S. would be just fine, and the World Cup would be just fine, but it would move on. It's a bit of a different story if Messi's not there, because I think that would be. Obviously, this will be his last close to prime or prime World Cup. So for him to miss it would just be a real shame. And I don't think if you're a fan of the sport, as much as people like underdogs, you got to be cheering for them against Ecuador in that final match day. And if they win that, they're probably going to be in. So I wouldn't completely panic yet. But if you're Russian organizers, maybe you're panicking a little bit here. And just if you're a fan of the sport, you got to want to see Messi in it. And I mean, there's a possibility, because if you look at the European qualifying too, Kevin, that both Ronaldo and Messi could miss the World Cup, and that's just wrong.
Yeah, well, that would be wrong. And I remember for the last, 8 to 12 years, whenever Messi's been in international soccer, it was always a question of time. We're not wondering if they would win the World Cup with Messi. We're wondering when and how many. Now it's closer to a Tiger Woods situation where you're not sure if he's ever going to get back to, at least international wise. You're not sure you're going to break the record, right? Tiger Woods never going to break Jack Nicklaus's record now. So it's kind of like that situation. We're getting late into Messi's career where his prime is coming slowly at the end, and because it's every 4 years, the next cycle might be just a bit too late, and the rest of the world of football would have caught up to Messi a bit, and Dybala maybe would have got that torch from Messi at that point. But now, you're right, we could have a situation where Messi, potentially the best player to ever play the game, or the best finisher to ever place boots and walked on a soccer pitch, could finish his career without ever winning the Jules Rimet trophy.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Canada's not in World Cups, as we know very well. So I typically do actually, take Argentina as my big team I cheer for in a World Cup, because I want to see Messi do well. I want to see him, finish cap his career that way. Also, I don't know, maybe because my first World Cup that I can remember is, and now I'm going to age myself, is '86, and obviously Argentina won that one, so perhaps that's part of it too. But it would just be kind of sad to not have them there. Just kind of sad, Kevin. But, you mentioned Tiger Woods there. Just real quickly, has there ever been an athlete fall off a cliff in any more spectacular way than that? Like, that was literally he hit a wall. Like, it was
no, he hit a tree, Duane. That's what happened. He hit a tree.
Yeah, well, he hit a
tree, and an iron hit him too while the car.
Yeah. But I can still remember that. That was one of the first big Twitter days. When something big happens and Twitter explodes and everyone's making jokes and that was one of the first ones. And I can distinctly remember sitting in my den, and I was my condo in Mississauga at that point, and sitting there staring at the skyline, watching my Twitter blow up and go, "What's happening? Oh my God, this is funny. Oh, this is great. This is amazing. This is Twitter thing. It's great."
I think it was exactly 5 or 6 years ago. Anyways, I remember I had those, those memories on Facebook, and I remember at one point we didn't know what was happening. All right, and I remember distinctly when we just knew that Tiger Woods was in an accident. I remember tweeting, thoughts with Tiger Woods. Hopefully everything's all right. Yeah, was I wrong?
Oh dear. Hot takes off the top. No,
but you're right. I don't outside of Lance Armstrong, and Lance Armstrong is for maybe different reasons. I say maybe because we truly don't know what happened in Tiger Woods' career. And I think there'll be more to know in the future than what meets the eye. But to see a fall from grace on the field, or on this case, on the courses, and off the courses, I think it's the greatest example ever.
Yes, fair enough. All right, back to soccer. Okay, we talked about U.S. And the Canada friendly. There's nothing. Do you really want to talk about the Canada friendly anymore? I don't really think there's much to say. It is on Canada Soccer, as we guessed. So if you want to watch it, it's 5 p.m. on Sunday.
On
it'll be
Canada
streamed.
Soccer YouTube, and you can find it on CanadaSoccer.com. And there'll be a few Voyagers there. And there's the Maple Leaf Lodge, a bar kind of place in Houston that is serving poutine and Canadian delicacies. We'll be hosting the Voyagers before the game. So hopefully the Voyagers that are traveling to Houston have a safe and fun time.
Exactly. Look, if you're traveling to Houston, I question, how. Can I have some of your money? But nonetheless, maybe you'll
if you're going to Houston for a friendly, yeah, we need to be friends.
Alas. Enjoy the game, though. Enjoy Houston, I guess. I've never been to Houston, so I shouldn't say. Yeah, look, we'll talk about the U.S. a little bit before we go here. Jeff sort of thought that they would have enough to get by Panama. I kind of agree. I think that they will probably put things out of question today. Even if they do get that draw, I think they'll probably be safe for fourth, because I don't think Costa Rica is going to lie down, and I don't think Honduras has enough to get past even a B Mexico side, really, if they're in a World Cup qualifying situation in that final match day. So Honduras' schedule is a little tougher to close out, playing the top two teams in the group. But the question I have when it comes to the Americans is, even if they scrape through here, like, is this obviously they won the Gold Cup, but it was a weird Gold Cup, and you probably should take that with a grain of salt, because it was truly, it might not have even been a B World Cup or Gold Cup in this particular situation. It might have been a C Gold Cup, the way that Mexico took it anyway. My question then is if they do scrape in, and I think they will, what realistic expectations does this team have heading into Russia? Is this a down cycle, or is just CONCACAF raised up? Can they do what they've done? They have been a tournament team in the past. They have managed to get out of groups consistently. They sort of hit a wall in the round of 16, but I think that's kind of their ceiling right now anyway. I mean, I'm sorry, Americans, but I do. Can they match that, or have they actually slipped back? Is this a mirage that was based on Klinsmann's flounderings, or is this the real level that the U.S. is right now, in your opinion?
Well, maybe it's a little lower than the level that the U.S. are at the moment. I think form has something to do with it. Yes, Panama might not be Costa Rica, hopefully, but Panama's looking to be future Costa Rica, maybe in 4 years' time, and to do so, they need. I was gonna say a bad analogy, but they need trophies on the wall. Let's put it this way. So, yeah. And one of them could be the United States, and tonight it could be those landmark results for an up and coming emerging country at the upper level of CONCACAF to work on, to use as a standard and build off of. So I wouldn't be surprised if Panama comes gun blazing tonight in Orlando.
Well, I mean, the other side of the equation, we're talking about the U.S. because we focus on them, but the other side of the equation is if Panama wins, they're in. And, those players are motivated by that. The U.S. has been vulnerable at home in this cycle. So I'm sure that if you're in that Panama camp right now, that's exactly what they're saying is, you know what, let's just take care of business today. Let them worry about themselves. Obviously, TNT is an easier touch. I wouldn't completely... that's a high pressure game if they were to, let's talk worst case here. If they were to lose the game tonight and head into the TNT game, they are the favorite even on the road, I think, in that game. But the pressure that they have in that moment is pretty immense, because who knows, maybe, especially if Honduras gets a result of any kind tonight and jumps ahead of them, and they're going to need something down there. It would be really a remarkable game to watch. That would be one we'd be all gathered around to see. All right, Kevin, that's my final thought on the day. We'll wish our Canadian listeners a happy Thanksgiving. I'm not too sure what we're going to do on Monday. We'll see. Kevin and I will talk off air. But yeah, so happy Thanksgiving to our Canadian listeners, and happy Monday to our American listeners.
Yeah, it's just Monday. And you can follow Duane on Twitter, as always, at 24th Minute, and myself at Kev Laramee. Thanks to Jeff for being on the show today once again. You can keep an eye on our social media throughout the weekend to get our take on the international break. And as always, until maybe Monday, but for sure Tuesday, as always, have a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.